So we're starting with Matthew 1, verses 1 to 3. Then we're going to follow with verses 5 to 6 and 16 to 17. The record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac, Isaac fathered Jacob, and Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez fathered Hezron, and Hezron fathered Ram. Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth, and Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David the king. David fathered Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations.
Good morning, all. Once again, welcome to MCC. My name is Matt, and I'm one of the leaders here at MCC, just in case we haven't had the pleasure of meeting. Sorry, guys. Yeah, that's not the. Thanks. So this is the last Talking Out Christmas series, and I figured I was keen to kind of tackle something that I hadn't done before over the years, or that we haven't as a church really covered that much. And I figured it was worth getting something that was supremely user-friendly, easily accessible, something like a topic that almost preaches itself. Hence, we're looking at the genealogy that kicks off Matthew's Gospel. Honestly, genealogies, family trees, like that kind of thing, they aren't something that naturally intrigues me very much. I figure it's probably a kind of interest that comes to a guy once they reach a particular age and stage in life, much like golfing, road cycling, and taking photos of every restaurant meal that you enjoy and putting them up on social media. All things that I'm looking forward to enjoying as I get just a little bit older. But I promise you, there is something I think valuable and relevant in this particular opening passage of Matthew's Gospel. And sure, it doesn't make its way into very many nativity plays. It's not really front and centre when it comes to Christmas cards as a rule. But interestingly enough, it's how Matthew chose to set up, to frame, if you like, his story of Jesus. So this is really the opener for the Christmas story as we know it. And it's also the opening of his entire Gospel. His biography, if you like, of Jesus. So for those reasons alone, it's certainly worth looking at. Now, really importantly, we need to believe and know that Matthew had a particular agenda in relation to how he wrote it. And to be a responsible reader of this gospel and the genealogy, we need to discern what his purpose was, if you like. So the risk is we can take our modern meanings of what genealogies represent and how they're scripted, and we can kind of project that onto Matthew's. So we can read our kind of modern day emphases into his original genealogy. So really importantly, we can't expect his genealogy to be the equivalent of a modern historical record or genealogy or family tree that we'd be familiar with. It's a different genre, if you like, of literature. So to compare modern genealogies with Matthew's and those of his time, it wouldn't be comparing apples to apples. Because as you may be aware, Matthew's genealogy is different from Luke's. So Luke opens his gospel also with a genealogy of Jesus, and they're different. Matthew, we know he misses generations and people that we can read about in the Old Testament. Now, presumably, Matthew made these omissions on purpose. He wasn't stupid, he knew what he was doing. So he had the omissions and he included those that he did intentionally. They were important to his purposes, and there's clues all the way through it, such as the 14 and 14 and 14 that we can read about in chapter 1, verse 17. So 14 generations, and then 14 generations and 14 generations. This stuff mattered to him. So the first question is asking ourselves, what was his primary purpose? What was his big idea, his big intent in putting this genealogy together? And the big clue is in the opening verse. So if you've got your Bibles with you, I'd encourage you just crack them open to chapter 1, verse 1. And it reads, at least in most translations, something like, "This book is of the story of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." So we've got three titles here in the first verse: Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Jesus Christ is a title, importantly. It's not a name. So it could be translated Jesus the Christ. Matthew only uses this title, Jesus Christ, twice more in his entire gospel. Instead, he usually refers to Jesus in the more personal name of just Jesus. Christ, the title, is a Greek. It's a Greek way, the Greek translation of the Jewish word for Messiah. And Messiah means anointed one. And in Jewish culture, anointed ones were usually leaders, so people set apart by God to perform special leadership functions in the community. So usually we're talking kings and prophets. So Jesus the King. That's the first title. And then we've got Son of David. David was Israel's greatest king. So this title is pointing out that Jesus is descendant of royalty. And the supreme example of royalty, of kingship in the Old Testament in Jewish history was David. David was a conqueror. He was a military king. So Son of David would have likely had associations with a conquering king. And at the time of Matthew's audience, a conquering king would be the kind of king that would kick the Romans out of Israel and re-establish national sovereignty. And then the last title, Son of Abraham. Abraham, the original patriarch of Israel, with whom God made a special covenant with, a special promise. And one of the promises that was attached to this covenant, to this agreement, was that all nations would be blessed through Abraham. And we read that in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. So there's this universal blessing, if you like, and promise associated with Abraham that by extension is also now relevant to Jesus, being the son of Abraham, courtesy of that title, especially when placed in the same context as Jesus the Christ and son of David. So this story, and this is the big point of this story of Jesus, this biography, it begins with some pretty big claims about Jesus, some huge claims. Long promised, long expected, much anticipated king, anointed one, son of David, so some kind of military king, a conqueror, and son of Abraham, someone who's going to be associated with all these blessings. And then we move straight into the genealogy. Now again, important to remember, these ancient genealogies served particular purposes. So they're often used to kind of guarantee the credibility, if you like, of a specific role, such as a priest or a king. So Matthew is using his genealogy to present both Jesus' family identity and also his fittingness as the messianic king, the long-promised king. So genealogies, or these kind of family trees, they help establish back then whether someone had the credibility, whether they were actually legit to carry out a usually important role. Scott Sauls, who's a pastor and commentator, he wrote a great post on this a couple of weeks ago that kind of got me thinking about doing this as a topic. So a lot of this kind of stems from him, was his really good idea and inspiration. He wrote that ancient genealogies could be compared to modern CVs, if you like. So an ancient genealogy was the equivalent of a modern day CV. They help answer the question, to prove the point. Is this person really qualified for the role that they're about to step into? So to summarise up to now, we've heard that Jesus is introduced as the Christ, so the anointed king, son of David, so the anointed king of the Davidic line, and the son of Abraham, so associated with God blessing all of humankind. And now we turn to his CV. And you see there that it begins with Abraham. And as has already been mentioned, it's broken up into 3 sections of 13, 14, and then 13 generations. And the most illustrious and important example or descendant that is mentioned there is David. Again, King David. He's like the obvious kind of, I suppose, high point. So that's pretty stock standard. But here's the first really surprising feature of the genealogy. Look who else is here and gets a mention. Verse 3, Tamar. Verse 5, Rahab. Verse 5, Ruth. And verse 6, Bathsheba. Four women are mentioned, three of which were most likely Gentile, that is, non-Jewish. Again, non-Jewish in a genealogy that is all about promoting the son of David and the promised messianic king. And again, at least three of these women would have had suspect reputations, at least in some eyes, regarding their sexual morality. So we've got women, which in a patriarchal culture and in Jewish culture, not unprecedented, but very unusual to have them mentioned in a genealogy. And again, not just any women, but women from three of them at least from a non-Jewish background and a suspect reputation. Ruth was a Moabitess. Now in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3, it states that up to the 10th generation, so the 10th generation, a Moabite was not allowed to join the congregation of Israelites. That is, they couldn't even become a proselyte of Judaism. And here we have a Moabitess mentioned in the genealogy. So four women, again, not strange at all to our modern ears, but unusual in the least when it comes to biblical genealogies. And again, not just any four women, but basically those that had a checkered past. In Jewish writing at the time, if you were going to highlight any four women, it was a lot more common to have the fabulous or faithful four: Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, the matriarchs of the nation of Israel. But instead, we have these four. And again, critically, Matthew didn't have to mention them. He omitted other people when he put this genealogy together, so he must have intentionally included them here. Why? We'll get to that in a second. But while we're here, it's also worth noting that Abraham and King David, again often regarded as heroes of the Christian faith and moral examples, were far, far, far from perfect. Abraham treated his wife Sarah shamefully out of cowardice and lack of trust in God on at least two occasions. And David, as we know, though a man after God's own heart, was capable of both adultery and murder. A fact that we're reminded of when we read Bathsheba's name in the genealogy, because it mentions her former husband Uriah, the very guy that David disposed of. And then you've got Jacob, a supreme trickster, and Solomon, former wise man and now full-on womanizer. So a bunch of kind of checkered people. So on the one hand, we're told right at the beginning of the Christmas story that Jesus is the fulfillment of these long-held hopes and expectations. He's the Christ. He's the son of David. He's the son of Abraham. But then we're also told that his family tree has all these dubious, or at least, I guess, not accepted at the time, or at least far from perfect characters in it. So what are we to make of this? How do those two things go together? Maybe a message that Matthew wanted his readers to hear was that God works with, God even partners with, real people. And real people means flawed people, broken people even. Again, this is the apex of history. The Christ, son of David, son of Abraham, God made flesh to dwell amongst his creation and rescue them. This is a big deal. And Matthew was pointing out that to get here, God has used the outsider, the scandal-ridden, the victim, the perpetrator, people whose names you didn't expect to see included in the family tree, the CV of Israel's long-awaited king and liberator. So this Christmas, what may this mean for us? Let me finish with three possible implications. First of all, I reckon you could read this family tree as a mirror, if you like. So I read it, and I can't ignore some of the flawed characters. But then the penny drops if I read and meditate on it enough. I read about the flawed characters, I'm also a flawed character. And maybe the question isn't whether someone is flawed or not, but have they not just acknowledged that fact, but accepted the fact that they're deeply flawed or not. There's no one in that family tree who was perfect. No one there listed who had it all together. And maybe that's because God can't partner with those who don't recognise that they need him. Those who deny, I think, reality and think that they're adequate in and of themselves. Again, let's remember David, Israel's most successful king, warrior, poet, a man after God's own heart. Even David was broken, and more critically, knew that he was broken, knew how much he needed God. And I find this strangely encouraging because far from Christianity being a kind of idealistic, fantastical religion, it is just so grounded in reality, at least the way that I interpret reality. It doesn't shy away from that, but puts it front and centre. So that's the first thing. The family tree can be like a mirror. Second, the family tree is also a motivator. In Luke's Gospel, in chapter 7, we read the account of the sinful woman who poured expensive perfume on Jesus' head. A strange sound, like to our ears, a strange sounding incident. And wiped his feet with her tears, dried them with her hair. And the religious onlookers were just horrified at this spectacle. But Jesus' verdict was, they who were forgiven much, love much. They who were forgiven little, love little. From verse 47 in chapter 7. That is, the more that we realise the magnitude of grace, that is the unmerited love and forgiveness that Jesus has shown us, the more ready, willing and able we'll be able to show it to other people. Now, this is supposed to be, of all times in the year, a time of peace on earth and goodwill to all people. A time where perhaps we demonstrate what is, I think, the hardest command from the Sermon on the Mount, loving our enemies. And this family tree from Matthew's Gospel can remind me, like a mirror, that I need to be forgiven much. I'm flawed and I need God's grace. But further to that, my enemy, if you like, or the person who I think has wronged me, has disappointed me, has let me down, didn't laugh enough at my jokes or whatever, they need that grace too. We have that in common. The distance between us, if you like, just isn't that vast. And please hear me here, I'm not suggesting that all acts of evil or immorality are equal. I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting, and this is an insight from Scott Sauls, which I found really powerful, is that on a universal scale, I more resemble my enemy or the worst person that I can think of. I more resemble them than I resemble Christ in all his goodness and in all his love. Does that make sense? Yeah, and that's heavy. So far from feeling morally superior to people whose actions I regard as evil, I should be praying for them. Instead of demonising them, loving them. And I don't know how you guys have found it, but on a purely personal note, I've really needed to have been reminded of this after the months now of events in the Middle East, and seeing and hearing about just the malevolent glee that some of those involved have taken in hurting and harming those on the other side. I found myself starting to kind of think of these acts as being monstrous. And of course, the risk is that if you start to think of people's deeds as being monstrous, it's easy to start to view the people as being monsters. And once you start viewing people as monsters, it implies they're no longer human. And once you start to regard people as being less than human, it becomes much easier to justify any kind of evil that you can think of to carry out on them because they're subhuman. And this family tree reminds me and motivates me that people are people. So again, Christ the King, Christ the Anointed One, he didn't spring from some pure, noble line of perfect moral exemplars, the good guys, as opposed to the bad guys. His family tree is made up of flawed people, people like me. And lastly, if the family tree is both a mirror and a motivator, it's also, and most of all, a mercy and a comfort. It makes this message so clear. Whoever you are, there's room for you here. There's a place for you here. There's a meaningful role to play in God's family and plans. Whoever you are and whatever you've done, you belong here. Unlike almost any other context in our world, you don't have to perform. You don't have to bring something to the table. You don't have to hide or to overcompensate for your faults. You don't have to try to cover up or deny whatever it is that you've done or should have done and didn't do. You don't have to maintain the mask and keep the plates spinning. In fact, in a topsy-turvy, upside-down way, the very real weaknesses, or to use religious language, the thorns in our flesh, these very things, God, in his power and mercy, can use. They can push us closer to him and away from arrogance and just delusions of superiority. So I'm not organised enough as a rule, and it just continually hamstrings me. I don't get everything done that I should get done and could get done. But I know that, to some degree, God can use this to stop me from getting an even bigger head and bigger ego, because my flaws are apparent to me. And it makes me kind of rely on him, or at least see all the stuff that still happens, all the good things that happen that do get done, independent of me and my efforts. So it kind of pushes me, makes me realise his providence more. And hopefully it gives me a bit more empathy for other people when they aren't organised enough and they don't do what I think they're capable of doing as well. So all of that, again, those weaknesses within me, he can use in such gracious ways. So this Christmas, please be encouraged. Maybe you're feeling embittered or angry about a broken relationship in which you've been wronged and hurt. Again, remember, we all need to be forgiven, so much. Or maybe you feel on the outside. You don't fit the stereotype of a typical spiritual person. Or maybe you're carrying around a heap of disappointment and guilt about stuff in the past or likely future. And you're worried that that's going to somehow disqualify you from being loved or even used by God. Then again, look at this family tree and be comforted. Young or old, there's a place for you. We can, in the end, I think, be defined, or at least define ourselves, by the grace that God shows us and all the good things that come out of that. Or we can be self-defined by the mistakes that we've made or the trauma and hardship that we've endured. And it's worth just remembering the grace that we talk about here. It costs us absolutely nothing. The only thing that we've got to do is be able to take all the stuff that I usually rely on for the basis of my sense of self, my achievements, my intelligence, my morality, my status, my independence, my blunt force charisma. I can take all these things that on a bad day I rely on to kind of define myself, and there's nothing wrong with any of those in and of themselves, but I need to lay them down and realise that isn't grace. That's not why and how God loves me. Even better summed up in this great quote by Tim Keller. If you want God's grace, all you need is need. All you need is nothing. And that's what I think this genealogy reminds us of. Let me pray. Father, we thank you for your realism. Thank you that following you, believing in you, doesn't mean living in a fantasy world. Doesn't mean having to, again, pretend that everything is easy and perfect and good when it's not. Thank you that we can just trust that you're more familiar with our flaws, with our shortcomings than we are, and you love us. You love us more than we can even love ourselves. So I pray, Father, particularly over this period of the year, help us find true comfort in that. Help us revel in your love for us, in your grace for us. And I pray that will motivate us to just show that same love and that same grace and benevolence to other people who you've placed us amongst. I pray, Father. Thank you that we have each other, we have your Spirit, we have your word. Again, with all these examples, real, checkered examples from the past that show us that even hundreds, thousands of years later, these very flawed people can still serve through your grace as a source of encouragement to us, Father. And I pray we will take comfort from that and just realise that even when things seem dire for us and we can be just so weighed down with our shortcomings and our flaws, Father, that again, through your grace and despite our weaknesses, you can do stuff with that will serve as a blessing to people here and now and maybe even the future. Amen.